Thanks, Arvind, for coming again. I think second time for my GST. Arvind Subramanian, of course, doesn't need any introduction, so I think we'll start off straight away. And, the first question, of course, I'm sure everyone will ask is the reasons for your leaving. An impending arrival of a grandchild. I don't think many people are buying that. So maybe we can start off. You can say off the record or on the record or whatever.
As you all know, my initial contract was for 3 years. That was a natural point, but then I think, the finance minister said, stay on for some more time. And then this personal, imperative of, having to go back and, I have neglected a lot of my family responsibilities, having come here, been away from the family for 4 years. And this was absolutely our son and daughter-in-law wanted us to be close by so that, we could all both enjoy and share both the joys and some of the burdens of grandparenting. And I felt it was, everything came together, so it was just the right thing to do. And it seems like, at least from the people may want to attribute motives, but it's completely clear that, the compelling personal reasons were the reasons to go back. Look, all economies at all points of time are very challenging. I think there's no, now is more challenging thing. I mean, remember that you could. I'm not saying one is more than the other. I'm saying that they're just different challenges at different points in time. When the government came into power, the whole twin balance sheet, so many years of low investment decelerating, the whole policy paralysis, macro instability. So I think they were implementing these major GST reform, right, which had been stuck for so many years. I think India is a vast country, lots of people, very talented people. So it's not as if the economy is in any way management is going to change drastically because I leave. So maybe in that sense, a wrong time to leave or a right time to leave. I think it's just. I will not be physically present does not mean that I will not be available or contributing to on an ongoing basis, should I, either asked or even unprovoked. The good thing is that I do have, very good communication with, lots of people in the Ministry of Finance and the Prime Minister's office. So, if my services are really required, I'm always will be ready to provide them. Hopefully we'll get a very good successor who will also continue doing this. Kind of life goes on and you can't, pitch this on one person or anything. It shouldn't be. We should have an institution where lots of people come and go, and I think that's how it should be.
When Raghuram Rajan left, one of the points that people made was really that this is about Modi's or this government intolerance. So now that you're going, what are the level of, how easy was it for you to be actually able to give your inputs on things that you didn't agree to? Just to take an example here, when you criticized the cattle law, you did it in this amazingly roundabout manner. Instead of saying, hey guys, this is just a bad idea, you said anything that affects the terminal value of the end product will be bad. I mean, you couldn't be more circuit. So how difficult has it been to operate in this government?
There should be no even residue of a notion that this is this government can't hold talent, because you see what the finance minister said. What I've genuinely believe that I've had such a great time here. It's been the best job. So there's no question of this being any pattern where some people came and were forced out. Not at all. I mean, this was a really for me a very productive association with the government. Second, I think that remember that also, and the point I want to make is that a lot of the tenor of the reaction to my leaving, highly complimentary, but complimentary in this slightly, kind of despite government, he did very well kind of thing, right? I think that I would not have been able to contribute as much and do as much had the government actually bought into this conception of what I wanted to do. The freedom I was given, the space I was given is all credit to the government. I mean, after all, they could have said, go away, we don't want you speaking. Absolutely not. I mean, and in this, especially the finance minister has just, given me so much space and freedom that I was able to say these things. And more, so internally, for example, I mean, the freedom with which I have been allowed to speak has been extraordinary. I mean, I've not held back in terms of my private views at all, which is how it should be. The only question is in public, what do you say or not say? And there too, I think I have been reasonably outspoken, but I think in all of this, you have to be a little bit, naturally behave responsibly. I mean, it's both a matter of decorum and my own sense of decorum in terms of what I want to say in public in terms of why should I want to publicly criticize the government? Then I shouldn't be part of the government, right? You do want to maintain that absolute decorum, but you also sometimes you think that maybe saying some things in public are more likely to bring about the change you want to see. For example, as you know, I've been outspoken about monetary policy sometimes, with this, and the government has let me say that I've said things about the GST, for example. I've expressed my views on how it should be done. So I think on. There's no question of this, this one more person departing because the government can't hold this, because, that's just not true in my case. I mean, I've had enormous freedom internally and externally. I mean, for example, the surveys that we wrote, I don't think, it could have been written had the government not, been willing to give me the space to write these surveys, because surveys like this were never written before, as you know, and apart from, the manner in which it was written, but also, the fact that, sometimes the survey would say things that were not supportive of government policy. I think Raghu's, thing was, context was different, Arvind's context was different, my context is completely different.
Apart from the price of oil, what is the biggest headwind for India's economy today?
Yeah, I think that there are, I mean, as always, I think there's a lot of upside potential, but there are also headwinds. I think the short run, the most immediate macro headwind is as you said, oil, combined with the fact of capital outflows and the risks of protectionism and so on. But I think in terms of broader, I think challenges that we have, I mean, I do think that. And I'm not trying to over-intellectualize this. I do think more and more, having been here in India, I think this what I call stigmatized capitalism, I think that is coming in the way of a lot of reforms. The fact that it's getting very difficult, I mean, to make decisions that will involve bringing in more of the private sector, whether it's privatization or exit or whatever. I think this is what I call the mahal of the stigmatized capitalism, where the public sector officials are finding it difficult to take decisions because of the fear that at some point it will be questioned, investigated. And by the way, this is kind of true for all governments of all stripes, and now for many, many years, and it's going to be true many things going forward. Now, so the bad news is it's going to complicate lots of things, whatever, right? We know privatization, maybe a subsidy reform, even the whole twin balance sheet challenge, which I'll come to. I think that's going to be affected. But I think the good news is that I think with the IBC, we've really, I think, broken at least partially the back of the stigmatized capitalism when it comes to this. But I think that, so we're finally finding a way out of exit. But I think the truth is that more and more exit and decisions like this will only be possible via a judicial approach rather than a pure political administrative approach. So I do think that maybe even going forward, we can't make the IBC the only game in town because it's going to be overburdened, it's going to delay things. So we may need to find some carve-outs in order, in fact, to expedite the process. So I think stigmatized capitalism is overcoming that is going to be a major problem for us, especially if we want to move in the direction of a more market-oriented economy. See, the problem is very fundamental because if you think you can't trust capital, because whatever, the way they've gotten ahead in the past, whatever scandals and everything, you can only trust capital, private capital, if you can trust the ability of the state to regulate private capital. So the deeper, I think, paradox or thing is that how do you get this deeper trust in the state or the effectiveness of the state, the credibility of the state, the legitimacy of the state to regulate private capital? There's one more challenge because given that Harish is here, I do think that, again, something that I've learned and something that I've been influenced by events and for which I don't have a good answer is that, we've come into a paradoxical situation in agriculture where when you have not so good monsoons, we're in trouble. But when we have very good monsoons, we're also in trouble. So this, Harish has done an absolutely amazing job, documenting this thing about, we're in a surplus situation and yet farm incomes are in trouble. Because remember, that never used to be the case. If there were good monsoons, it was good for the farmer as well. So stigmatized capitalism, agriculture, and of course then we can talk about other things, but these would be at least, in terms of contemporary challenges, two big ones.
3 years back, you were a votary of being slightly not fiscal loosening, but some kind of fiscal flexibility, along with I think a more in terms of monetary being slightly more accommodative than the RBI. What is it like today? Would you advocate any kind of fiscal loosening today?
When we had macroeconomic situation under control, when we had slack in our economy, when growth was decelerating, investment was decelerating, what I advocated, remember, not fiscal relaxation, but slower fiscal consolidation. Yeah, not relaxation. Remember, that was the debate people used to think, and more, monetary policy to be done. Now, I think situation has changed completely. Oil prices are higher. The international environment is much more uncertain. Capital flight. I think in these situations, Minister Jaitley wrote a blog saying exactly this. I think that if inflation is becoming a concern, things and markets, you have to be responsible. So I think that there's no question of fiscal relaxation in these circumstances. And also, I think if inflation has gone up and if the RBI is mandated to achieve whatever target, I think therefore your policy has to be consistent with the changing circumstances. So I think, see, in these situations, there's been capital, going back for both mostly external reasons, and maybe for some internal reasons as well. Capital is going out for some fundamental reasons. If we address those fundamental reasons, the problem will solve itself. But if we don't address those fundamental reasons, many of which are beyond our control, doing these things will not help unless you have a subsidy, because that's why capital is leaving. So I think I'm very clear on that one, yeah.
There was talk some time ago, which you mentioned, there was some talk or rumor or whatever about America, or threat of America talking about India as a currency manipulator.
But that's, I think, see, remember that the Treasury has 3 criteria for defining currency manipulators. When you breach 2 of those, you are put on a watch list. That is that you're just going to be monitored, and not that a currency manipulator. The thing is that 2 two of those three criteria, and let me be very candid, are basically nonsense, right? One of those criteria is a bilateral trade deficit, which everyone knows is neither here nor there. And the second thing about the purchases of foreign exchange criterion. So analytically, conceptually, these are flawed criteria. But I think, moreover, I think these are not. It's just on a watch list. It's not going to make much difference.
So you've also been clear on Air India's disinvestment, which could not happen, and while the industry said that the terms and conditions put forth by the government weren't conducive enough for them to buy, the government has said that the macro conditions, including currency and the oil prices right now, did not let this happen. So, but you have said that it should have happened by the end of fiscal 2018. So where do you stand on that?
You've read the survey closely. I think it is a setback. I think we have to, why, I don't follow this very closely, why it hasn't happened, whether it's macro or whatever conditions, that's for others to figure out. But I think we need to, find fresh ways of, carrying through with a commitment that the government has always had. And the Prime Minister has always had, he always said minimum governance. I think, so if you want to, I think, inspire confidence in the economy, I think we need to push through with this agenda. And, we should push through with an agenda in which, assets are sold to the private sector, the pure private sector, as it were.
In the last few years, there have been more than visible tension between the Finance Ministry and the Reserve Bank of India. You have been a vocal critic of the monetary policy at many times. And during the PNB loan scandal, we saw government claiming supervisory lapses on part of RBI, and the governor saying that we don't have enough powers over the public sector banks. So just wanted to ask you, as an economist, purely as an economist, do you find the balance between RBI and the Finance Ministry in India less than cordial, or it should be more harmonious? What are your views, perceptions?
See, I think all relations between government and RBI at some level should be harmonious. I mean, obviously, harmonious in things, but there will be some inevitable tension in their actions, because there are different sets of objectives so they can never be always on the same page. I mean, it's just intrinsic to their mandates and the instruments that they have and the objectives that they have. I think that the observation I would like to make is that about 25 years ago, there was this big intellectual shift where we said we need to have more independent central banks because of this whole inflation problem and so on. But if you look at what's happened since the crisis, I think, and especially now, I think we've seen probably a move back where independence is kind of gets less precedence or less importance. I think there should be, obviously, institutions should be independent, and more, how they should work together. Because, for example, in the crisis, essentially many of the advanced country central banks started performing quasi-fiscal operations. I think curtailing inflation is still very important, but I think more and more, I do think that government and central bank should work together, on financial stability. Inflation, of course, they have the man, but certainly on financial stability and even growth, I think maybe there should be more kind of a kind of convergence of objectives on that.
The specific question was that does the RBI have enough powers to look after the PSU banks, or is it they don't have, like they say? That's the specific question.
See, I have some sympathy for the view that it gets more complicated for a regulator when there's government ownership. I've said this, it's like a ménage à trois. It's a slightly risque metaphor, but I do think that public sector ownership complicates the regulator, because there's a kind of three-way relationship. But I think that it's also true that we've seen problems in private sector banks where this thing hasn't happened. So there's both probably merit in the view that public sector ownership complicates regulation, but also in the view that these problems were not only confined to the public sector, therefore there's also scope for improvement in regulation. So both are true.
Just to follow up, do you think the time has now come to denationalize public sector banks for at least some of them?
I mean, I've said that very clearly, that it has to be part of any reform going forward, and and I've explained this in gory detail why I think having public sector ownership adds at least 2 or 3 layers of governance or management problems, as it were. So for a variety of reasons, I think public sector ownership creates a governance challenge, and remember, I think people also seem to overlook the point that nobody is saying that the entire system should be private sector owned. I mean, we should allow for some more majority private sector ownership of the public sector banks, so that you have, 3, 4, whatever, pick your number, 3, 4 very well run public sector banks, 3, 4 very well run private sector banks, 1 or 2 whatever foreign banks, small banks, whatever, So we have the whole range, and we should allow that, facilitate that to happen.
What are the 4 big reforms this government has done, and what are the 4 bad things or other things they could have done better? If you can say 4 great reforms and 4 not so.
Yeah, I think GST would rank very high. I think the whole IBC is, I think, an absolute game changer. I think the whole JAM agenda, I think, has been, I think it's set in train, or at least accelerated what Devesh Kapoor calls the various connectivity revolutions in India. Digital connectivity, physical connectivity, financial connectivity, connectivity between the state and the citizen, all via Aadhaar, whatever, right? So I think that has been a major thing. And then I would say what we said in the survey. I think that I think one of the planks of government's policy has been, the public provision of essential private goods and services, bank accounts, housing, toilets, gas, power, pushing that agenda, with a lot of zeal. I think has made a difference in the lives of people, and I think that making the GST simple, is something that one can say. But I think one can also say that I'm hopeful that it will become simple over time. But I
a couple of examples of how it could be simplified, as in what are you thinking about in terms of simplification in GST? A couple of examples.
I think the 28% rate has to go. Okay, I think the cesses have to be more one rate on the cesses. We have multiple cess rates as well. I think that also has to think. I think at the lower end we have a 3 for gold. We have a 0, 3, 5, 10, 12, 18. We need to rationalize those at that as well. But I think in the first instance, the 28 and the cesses should be 28 should be eliminated.
% and cesses should go.
No, see, cesses. Remember, cesses. Yeah.
Except the compensations.
No, I'm saying no. Remember that in an ideal system, see, the 28 has to go, but the cess rates have to be there because we're going to have higher rates for those products. But there shouldn't be multiple rates there. Just one rate for all. Because even in my report I had said 18 and then a 140 rate, whatever. It should be one. And the cesses are just a different way of implementing the 40. But
what in your mind made this stigmatized capital happen? When this government came in, it was talking about privatization. Was it just that suit boot ki sarkar remark? Because now, when you talk about the public sector not being allowed to perform the 4 Cs and stuff like that, the fact is this privatization has been stalled at the level of the Prime Minister. And when he came, you got the impression that he was for privatization. So what actually changed? Was it just Rahul Gandhi saying "Soot boot ki sarkar"? What happened? Or did he just read the Prime Minister wrong?
These are all. I do think that stigmatized capitalism has proved to be more entrenched and more difficult than I think certainly I had anticipated when I first came to this job. I'm just being struck by, how deep this problem is and how the forces.
Suspicion of private capital.
And therefore what it does to public sector decision making. I think it's just been, and therefore the only game in town is therefore the judicial process.
I think one last question. Yeah.
We are witnessing a global trade war, initiated by the Trump administration. So what will be your advice to our government? How to tackle this? Should we restrict all our options to the tools available under the WTO framework, or we can go beyond that and effectively counter?
See, I think whatever we do should be consistent with WTO rules and consistent with the reasonable actions that other countries are taking. I don't think we should in any way step out of line and do things that either violate rules or go beyond what others are doing, because I think we have to face up to the fact that our ability to influence and shape things are more limited than those of other countries. I think it has to proceed from a recognition of how much influence we have. So I think I think we should be measured. We should be completely consistent with WTO rules, and I think that we should not deviate from that. I think I would say maybe the bigger challenge, I think, is that when all of this is happening around the world, it kind of tends to legitimize a broader shift towards protectionism in our own country. I think that's kind of the danger that we have to try and stay away from. That just because others are doing it doesn't mean that doing it will be in our interest. So I worry a little bit about the broader kind of policy ecosphere being affected by all that's happening in the world. Luckily, a flip side of not being that export-oriented an economy is that the fallout for us is maybe less than it is for other countries. But I think on the services side we have to be watchful. I think it could come back and affect us and therefore affect our growth. But I don't think we should do. Our actions should be consistent with the international rules. I'm just wondering, thinking more kind of creatively. We should spend more time maybe thinking about how we revive, multilateralism in the world economy, taking into account the fact that, the traditional leadership provided for multilateralism by the United States has waned, and on the other hand, kind of the new pretender, as it were, cannot provide this leadership because they're very protectionist themselves. So is there a scope for the medium-sized countries like India, Canada, India, Europe, Brazil, Mexico, who have a huge stake in keeping markets open because our development prospects depend on that? Can we do more by way of mobilizing a constituency that can kind of, revive multilateralism and kind of fill the huge vacuum and gap that's been created by, people say, to use the, I've also used this before. People say that we're in a G0 world. That is no one really providing international leadership. I actually wonder whether we're actually in a G- world. Actually, this is we have
No leadership.
It's a negative. Rudderless is G0, but we're in a G- world, and therefore, how do we deal with that? I think would be, and I think this is something that perhaps we don't do enough of in our, because we are, rightly concerned with our domestic, economy and things that, as a rising power, can we think also about how to, mobilize these international coalitions in a way that, because we can't do it on our own because we're just not big enough, but can we as part of a broader constituency that we, take the initiative of creating, fill in the gap that's been left behind. That would be my kind of more conceptual and forward-looking way of thinking about it. You see, the difficulty with stigmatized capitalism is that, and this is a genuine dilemma for the government, right? Because one of the responses to overcoming stigmatized capitalism is, going after the crooks and bringing them to justice. It has to be part of a response. But then, can you do it in a way that doesn't become kind of overzealous and overreach, right? And that is
It can't be the only response.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like demonetization.
So that's why I think that we have to do this, but I think that how we do it, incentives rather than carrots, even when you do, you have to have some kind of prosecutorial approach, can we do it in a way that, is well targeted and so on.
Thanks a lot,